So good afternoon from Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today, wherever you may be logging in from. I'm Shihoko Gerto, Deputy Director for Geoeconomics with the Wilson Center's Asia program. I would like to extend a very warm welcome especially to those of you who are joining us for the first time. The Wilson Center was established as an act of Congress in 1968. It is a living memorial to President Wilson and his commitment to international cooperation. President Wilson actually remains the only American president with a PhD. And we're excited that we will be spending the next hour discussing supply chains and global resilience, which has very much been in the news these days. The past year, we've been struggling with the very real shortages in medical equipment, which has led to some export restrictions, to a short-term stampede to hoard toilet paper. We've had disruptions caused by pandemics that have really forced us to think about the source, the affordability, accessibility of products that surround us. The past year has also forced us to acknowledge the fragility of supply chains, and that seamless movement of goods across borders cannot be taken for granted. It's also pushed us to reconsider weaknesses as well as strengths of global supply chains. But also we've been led to reconsider some of the inherent weaknesses as well as the strengths of globalization more broadly. It's also been a wake-up call for us to rethink economic policies that will not only further growth, but also ensure national security as well. We're very excited that we will be joined today by Representative Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin and my colleague Chris Sands, Director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Unfortunately, Representative Lisa Slotkin is unable to join us today due to a family emergency. I am also incredibly honored to be able to introduce Ambassador Mark Green, who was appointed last month as the Wilson Center's new president and CEO. Ambassador Green was formerly executive director of the McCain Institute, and before that, he was the administrator of USAID. His long and distinguished career has been devoted to public service, including serving as US ambassador to Tanzania, and he has served 4 terms in the House to represent Wisconsin's 8th district. With that, I turn the floor to Ambassador Green.
Great, thanks, Shihoko, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center, at least virtually. So I've been part of the Wilson Center, as Shihoko just said, for about a month now. And what drew me to the Wilson Center was our mission, helping leaders take on global issues through independent research, honest dialogue, and actionable ideas. And that makes today's discussion a perfect fit. Now, I'll tell anyone who will listen that I am optimistic about Congress and its ability to make progress on some of our most important foreign policy challenges. And the main reason I am is because we have leaders like Congresswoman Slotkin and my friend Mike Gallagher. These are members who are young in their political careers, but each with deep experience on matters of American leadership and global engagement, which makes them perfect for co-chairing this task force on defense supply chains. I am very grateful that Mike Gallagher has taken time out of his busy schedule to help us talk through some of the elements of building resilience in these crucial supply chains. So to state the obvious, the pandemic has placed a significant strain on global commerce, limiting travel and in-person meetings, exposing the weak links in global supply chains, and forcing companies to reevaluate their operations. Now, before COVID-19, reducing costs was the primary focus for businesses and national economies looking to improve competitiveness. Now it is the resilience of supply chains that has become paramount for business and trading partners. No longer does it make sense to focus solely on the bottom line and to manufacture goods overseas just because it's cheaper. People can't buy what can't be delivered. Policymakers care about the health and interests of private enterprise, to be sure. But of course, COVID pressures on supply chains are also affecting the flow of strategic priority goods as well, which brings us to today. Because access to critical minerals and rare earths, semiconductors, vaccines, and personal protective equipment, this is essential to our nation's interest on security grounds, and yes, even on humanitarian grounds. It's also a matter of smart power. Now, I applaud the Biden administration's steps in the area of vaccine diplomacy. The development of life-saving vaccines in record time was a great American success story, and President Trump is rightly proud of the accomplishment. Sharing in this success and helping countries shore up their healthcare systems will remind the world that our strength isn't merely derived from hard power, but also from the genius of private enterprise and market economies. But all of that will require security and resilience for our crucial supply chains. President Biden's executive order on US supply chains is an important step towards making those supply chains more transparent, more reliable, and yes, more resilient. American leadership in this area is important for strengthening cross-border supply chains. In the coming decade, we need allies willing to secure their links in supply chains and also willing to share data to give us the ability to see supply chain vulnerabilities. The line between military alliances and trading partnerships is disappearing as the pandemic persists. The US needs trading partners committed to our collective security as well, not just commercial opportunity. At the Wilson Center, our scholars are at the forefront of studying the factors that contribute to international relationships that improve global supply chain security and resilience. And I'm pleased you've just heard from Shihoko, and you're about to hear from Chris Sands, who's director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute and a member of our USMCA working group. But I'm particularly proud to introduce my friend, Congressman Mike Gallagher. So Shihoko just mentioned that Mike is from Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District. That is the district that I once represented. And it is easy to say that I am proud of Mike as my congressman in Northeastern Wisconsin. And I'm not just saying that because he's from Green Bay like me. I'm saying it because he does bring a unique combination of skills and vision. So not only is he an effective member of Congress and a sharp entrepreneur, but he is someone who has real world experience in the field as a member of the US Marine Corps. He's also someone who has served at the highest levels in the field and understands the crucial interplay between private enterprise, economic opportunity, and our national security interests. So again, I'm proud that Congressman Gallagher has joined us today, and I'm proud that we at the Wilson Center are hosting this discussion. So let me turn it over to you, Congressman Gallagher, for any opening remarks that you might want to make. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here, particularly with my good friend, Mark Green, and someone I consider a mentor and who was kind enough to take a call from a young high school student from Northeast Wisconsin a long, long time ago, asking for career advice. And I have been trying very imperfectly to follow in his very capacious footsteps ever since, and I can't think of a better person to lead this organization at a critical time. Alyssa and I have been doing a lot of this together. I know she had a family emergency, but I really think, obviously I can't speak for her, but I think if she were here, having done a few of these with her, you would notice that there is actually very little disagreement between us on these issues. I'm actually continually struck by the bipartisan nature of this conversation. And I do think, as has been mentioned, that one of the biggest and most enduring outcomes of the coronavirus pandemic is going to be to accelerate this discussion of shoring up our supply chain vulnerabilities, this discussion around onshoring or nearshoring or working closer with our allies to build a more resilient economy. I think we've just come to learn all too well over the past year that the security and resiliency of critical supply chains has a direct correlation to our national security. I always think back to almost a year ago today, in the early days of the pandemic, when you were going to Costco, hoarding various home goods, right? when it was right then when the Chinese Communist Party threatened to withhold life-saving medical supplies and plunge America into what it called the mighty sea of coronavirus. And when you look at the way in which the CCP has already weaponized key supply chains and economic leverage, whether it's with rare earth export bans to Japan in 2010, or threats against companies that acknowledge genocide in Xinjiang today, it's easy to see how the party would use any and all defense supply chain vulnerabilities in the event of a crisis to put our national defense at unacceptable risk. And all around us, I would argue the warning signs are flashing red. All it takes is a look at the Defense Department's industrial capabilities report from earlier this year to see how Chinese manufacturing capacity is dangerously outpacing ours. Take shipbuilding, for example. It's an area where I work a lot on and where we in Northeast Wisconsin build a few ships up here. In 2019, a third of all the vessels constructed in the world were made in China. China produces more than 80% of the world's ship-to-shore cranes and owns 7 out of 10 of the busiest ports in the world. And in just the last few weeks, a Chinese company signed a $1.5 billion deal for 13 massive container ships, most just a little smaller than the Ever Given, which made headlines for plugging up the Suez Canal and further illustrated the interdependency of the modern economy. It's not just that Beijing is outpacing us in shipbuilding, it's that we're not even running the same race. The situation is even less tenable when it comes to critical technologies that will play a central role in shaping our future economy and the future of national security, whether it's drone production. China accounts for 90% of consumer drone production, 70% of electronics manufacturing capacity. And if you add Taiwan's fabs to China's, the CCP could dominate 70% of the global integrated circuit production. So none of this is sustainable. We can't afford to have our defense industrial base experience the kind of supply chain disruption that our medical sector experienced during the early days of the pandemic. We can't afford to leave, potentially hostile foreign competitors with the ability to turn off and turn on the supply of critical supply chains that our national defense relies upon. So this is going to be, what I think will be the most important discussion, not only in this Congress, but over the next decade. And it's a bipartisan discussion. It's a monumental task. It's going to take all of our best and brightest thinking through some very complex issues. And so I'm honored just to be part of the beginning of this discussion today.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Before I ask Chris Sands to come in with his comments, I wanted to remind our audience, if you are joining us via webcast, there is a raise hand function. So please raise your hand if you do have any questions for any of the speakers. And for those who are watching online, unfortunately, that function is not available. But okay, so with that, Chris.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Shihoko. And I know you mentioned early on that Woodrow Wilson remains our only president who had a PhD, but listening to Congressman Gallagher, it may take a little while, but you could be the second one, sir. That very impressive presentation. I wanted to share my screen for a couple of slides. I know that slides are often very dull, but I think it'll allow me to make a couple of points as quickly as I can. And I'm going to focus a little bit on North American supply chains, mainly because Canada, the United States, and Mexico share some of the most sophisticated supply chains in the world. You've heard of some of the areas that we have here: defense, obviously automotive, agriculture, food, energy, medical services. We already have these supply chains. They're fairly sophisticated and complex. And so we're building from a position of strength when we think about global supply chains in a regional context. That didn't happen on its own. It happened because the US made a conscious effort to knit together our supply chains. And this is just a list. If you're a Canada watcher like me, some of this is easy to remember. But we first integrated our defense production process in 1956, integrated our auto industry's production starting in 1965. And then it's not always remarked on, but we approached our free trade agreements in North America using a rule of origin based system. And that put an emphasis on understanding the provenance of each piece of the supply chain. Now, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement started that. The rule of origin was modified for NAFTA. It was retained in USMCA. This gives us already a forward-thinking posture when it comes to the content of what we produce. So where Europe eliminating its borders and using an in or out system, you're either in Europe and the European Union or you're not. The way that North America developed its supply chains is extremely favorable to supply chain security and cooperation. Point out here just at the end, I want also that because of those trade agreements and the rule of origin system, we also found ourselves collaborating on a special needs basis. And the United States and Canada in 2019 started and then launched in 2020 a joint action plan on critical minerals collaboration. Canada has about 13 of the 34 top minerals in significant quantities, and we're already working with Canada on bringing those supplies on into the market, which I think is another signal of the great cooperation we have. We also, in order to make this work, have extensive cooperation in customs facilitation, inspection, and regulatory alignment. I want to underscore this because after September 11, the United States and Canada began the Container Security Initiative, which became a pattern for what we did elsewhere. In fact, we rolled out the Container Security Initiative in December of 2001. That's how quickly we moved to put this together. And what that means is that at ports around the world, the US and Canada jointly inspect containers, not only here in North America, but in places like Shanghai and Rotterdam, where we know each other's inspection protocols and we collaborate in making sure containers have what they're supposed to have. In addition, we have great border security cooperation. This is one of the reasons that where we've shut off international travel with some countries due to the pandemic, with Canada and also with Mexico, we have a joint border security approach that allows us to work together very seamlessly and move essential products in the supply chain back and forth across the border. Regulatory alignment is the last piece. It's something we could get better at, trying to reduce the regulatory burden on our companies. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the trends in North America are also really important. First, manufacturers are looking to increase the transparency and visibility of supply chains. Why? Because consumers want to know there's no forced labor involved in the production of what they're buying. And investors, for environmental social governance, want to know what's going into the supply chain of the company that I'm investing in, and does that reflect my values? At a time when supply chains connected to China are often quite opaque, North America is a leader in creating some of this visibility, which I think is very important. It's also necessary because as we decouple from the Chinese economy, as we start being more careful to look for sources of supply that aren't tainted or are inconsistent with our values, agility and resilience is really important. We need to be able to adjust flexibly and quickly, and we need to reduce the cost of operating in the supply chain, get back to that just in time that limits the amount of inventory in the supply chain. And as the congressman said, decoupling, reshoring, and even ally shoring, as people are starting to talk about now, really presents an opportunity to blur the line between alliance partners and trade partners. I think that's something that Ambassador Green has had as part of his vision of things, and I think he's quite right on that. So what do we do about it? A couple of things, just a few, promise. One, we need to do a better job of data mapping trade. Some of you will remember during the USMCA negotiations, we were actually being schooled by the Canadians who came around congressional district by congressional district to talk about what Canada did in terms of investment, job creation, employment in each and every congressional district. That's the power of data that we have because we have electronic bills of lading. There's a huge amount of data that's available for our North American supply chains now. But the US government hasn't ever data mined that to start mapping out our trade linkages. So we still now think of Michigan, my home state, as being an important state for trade, and it is, but it's disproportionately counted because it's where goods first enter the US. We're missing the importance of trade to a lot of the middle of the United States. Now, in the USMCA, negotiators did something very important, which is they said that publicly collected data, with respect for privacy, of course, should be made available to the private sector. And I think as governments, we've never really mined the data that we have. There's a real potential to let the private sector begin mapping supply chains using data that's collected by DHS, by customs, as part of the everyday transactions that we already have. The data exists. And I think having the private sector step in and start using technology to help us get a better picture of supply chains is not only an opportunity, but I also think it will help us be more sophisticated about how we can fine tune those supply chains. Next up, cybersecurity leadership. We are a Five Eyes partner with the Canadians, but that is primarily international intelligence. We could do much more commercial intelligence and cybersecurity leadership. If Canadian systems are in any way less protected than ours, they're a vulnerability for us as well. And so partnering with Canada to make sure that we're doing a better job of commercial intelligence sharing, looking at cybersecurity and setting standards, very high standards for what we expect here in North America, I think there's huge potential for that, and the Canadians would be good partners on that. Next up, regulatory mutual recognition. One of the things that will make our supply chains work better is cutting the duplicative red tape of ensuring compliance with various regulatory standards. Canada and the US have a number of standards that are in effect similar or have the same effect, but in practice slightly different. And so we have worked since Canada-US Free Trade trying to align our regulatory standards with modest success. I think it's time now, in the interest of improving public sector productivity, to do mutual recognition between the United States and Canada. If Canada proves a product is safe for the market, we should accept that as good enough for the United States and negotiate where we simply have a disagreement. What that will allow us to do, for example, is crash test one set of cars, not do that in Canada, the US, and Mexico. It will streamline decisions and it'll help us to move more quickly forward, leaning a little bit on Canada's regulatory capacity as well. Lastly, infrastructure. 74% of trade in North America between Canada, the US, and Mexico moves on land. As we look at investing in our infrastructure, I think there's a real opportunity to make priority for infrastructure that supports that trade and to leverage Canada and Mexico to make sure that the infrastructure doesn't stop at the border. It's not a bridge to nowhere, but actually connects us more closely. I have to make this pitch because I follow Canada. I'm not Canadian, I just like them. But I think Canada is a very good partner to start with. First, they're already a partner. Second, we share most of the same firms. We share some of the same enemies, same threats, particularly right now, China, but also other places too. We have shared values, particularly when we're looking at things like forced labor or the importance of enforcing sanctions. Canada generally agrees with us on most of those sanctions. And so they have an interest in making sure that we have a high value supply chain. And lastly, and this is something that we've done for decades with the Canadians, establish a model, work out the bugs, and then take that Canada-US partnership and make it the model for our relations with other countries. We can use Canada as, in effect, the first draft partner for improving our supply chain governance and fine-tuning those supply chains to stay competitive. With that, let me pass it back to you, Shihoko. I hope that was helpful, and I'll stop sharing screen.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was incredibly insightful, and it really gave a good overview of not only the situation in North America, but also the prospects and possibility of the United States furthering its relations with Canada when it comes to supply chains. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes really focusing on the semiconductor industry, because really no industry is as globally networked and also susceptible to disruptions as semiconductors. And we've seen that just simply by looking at the news. There is a global shortage in supply, not keeping up with huge demand. And that's particularly acute in the car industry. About 40% of car components are actually dependent on chips of various sophistication. 40%. About a decade ago, it was only 10%. So if we start going in to talk about automated self-driving cars, etc., then the need for chips just in a car will only increase. And so if we're already seeing that there is this strain in demand on chips that has been made very acute by COVID, demand is only going to go up even further. And again, this isn't just for the car industry. Chips are needed in everything, the laptop that I'm using, smartphones, of course, PlayStations, but basic things like household appliances, like refrigerators. When we talk about the IoT, the Internet of Things, and the integration of consumer goods, integration of infrastructure to transportation and the like, it's only going to increase demand for chips exponentially. And we talk a great deal about data being the new oil, but it's actually, in many respects, semiconductors that really are keeping the world running. And the reality is that we'll need far more powerful and sophisticated semiconductors. And it's actually at a very precarious stage where the demand is surging, and yet the supply is really not keeping up. And it's also skewed geographically as well. So there are really two parts when it comes to semiconductor development and production. And the United States remains the world leader for now in designing chips. But when it comes to actual production, East Asia dominates in fabs. And there are three places in particular that are at the forefront. And they are Taiwan, the Republic of Korea, and China. And there are high risks in depending so heavily on East Asian manufacturers, even if they're close US allies. Take the example of Taiwan, which dominates the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing sector, producing over 60% of the global market, with TSMC leading the pack. But Taiwan is also very vulnerable geopolitically. It is in the middle of increasing tensions with China. It's also vulnerable to natural disasters like earthquakes. And we've also seen that it's because of the water-intense nature of semiconductor manufacturing, a recent drought in Taiwan has really hit the chip industry there as well. So today's discussion really couldn't come at a better time to talk about semiconductors, because there is a meeting at the White House going on amongst industry leaders representing car makers, as well as semiconductor manufacturers, meeting together with the NSC's Jake Sullivan, NEC's Brian Deese, as well as the Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. And they'll be addressing the immediate needs that are being faced particularly by the auto manufacturers, who have been particularly hit by the lack of access to semiconductors in a timely manner, which has led to temporary layoffs, as well as a decrease in actual car output. But really, a successful outcome of this White House meeting should also focus on coming up with a strategic vision for the technology industry at large, and addressing some of the longer-term challenges facing the supply chain of critical supplies in particular. And the US semiconductor industry's future will be shaped largely by two things. One is whether the United States is actually serious about investing in chip manufacturing for the long haul. We've already seen the Biden administration committing up to $50 billion to invest in chips as part of its infrastructure package. And this is a great start, but the problem is that that investment really needs to be kept up. Bear in mind that fabs cost about $10 billion on average to start up, but that's just the initial investment. They need continuous investment as demand for smaller and more powerful chips increases. And then the other challenge, of course, is going to be how to integrate the design aspect of chips, which the United States excels at, with the very high cost and cutthroat business of producing ever more powerful chips, which requires constant research and development and constant investment to ensure that those products are actually made. The good news is that, well, perhaps it's not good, it's a double-edged sword. The United States is certainly not alone in meeting this challenge. Other governments are also finding similar difficulties in securing semiconductors. So earlier this year, we saw that the European Union announced that it aims to produce up to 20% of chips within the EU by 2030. And cynics, especially in the United States, have argued that that's much easier said than done. And that may or may not be the case, but what is clear is that Europe too is hedging both against depending too heavily on chips made in Asia, and also against chips that are solely designed in the United States as well. Later this week, we will have the Japanese Prime Minister Suga visit President Joe Biden in the White House. The Japanese Prime Minister will be the first foreign leader that Biden meets in his new capacity as president on his home turf. They will be discussing many things, but one of them will actually be about securing on technology and about semiconductors in particular. And there's expectation that there will be a bilateral effort to work together on developing supply chains for strategic technology components, including semiconductors, which entails not just production, but also research and development of next generation chips as well. So as we look to the challenges facing the United States and its allies, it is clear that the United States won't be able to reshore the chip production entirely to its own shores, even if there may be some loud voices to do so, simply because the costs are too prohibitive on the one hand, and also consumers will just not have the ability to increase the costs to match those rising costs as a result of reshoring. What the United States will need to do is to be able to balance technology competition with foreign governments and also work on technology cooperation. And for that, there needs to be a development of a network of trusted partners, that is to say, governments with shared values on security as well as economic growth to secure supply chains, especially on the technology front. So I know that, let me leave my comments there, and I know we do have a lot of questions. I, as moderator, I actually would like to use my prerogative to ask the first question to the congressman, but I'm actually going to yield it because I've seen one question from a audience participant who asks, there's a big disconnect between the aerospace and defense industry and Pentagon priorities. Most space and weapons platforms utilize mission critical microelectronics, while the Pentagon focuses on state of the art. So really the idea is, where can the money be best used to meet both the industry's needs and also the Pentagon's needs as well? It's a very open-ended question, but Congressman Gallagher, if you can answer that, that would be great.
Well, maybe I could sort of tie it to some of the bigger points that you were making, which I think are very important and worth emphasizing, because I do think that one area where there may be some bipartisan cooperation, or where I think you would see Republican congressional support for something the Biden administration is pushing, is in funding the CHIPS Act, which has already authorized an investment, a domestic investment in semiconductor research and development, and reportedly could be part of a package that Senator Schumer is sort of working through the Senate. I think as we've on the task force sort of examined the multiple areas where we have critical technology that's worth investing in, semiconductors rises to the top of the list. And I think all of your points about Taiwan are very well taken, because at least my view is sort of someone who tries to study these issues, but I'm not a regional expert. I mean, I was a Middle East expert who's now struggling to sort of learn about a different area of the world. That Chairman Xi not only views this as a legacy issue, but the ability to hold the whole world hostage by having effective control of TSMC is a very alluring prospect. And we had public testimony by Admiral Davidson, our top-ranking official in Indo-PACOM, that a move on Taiwan could come within the next 6 years, which to my knowledge is the first time something like that has been said publicly, which is alarming. So all of that is to say, I do think there's a lot of policymakers thinking through, how do we make a smart domestic investment in semiconductor manufacturing, which is more difficult than you think, right? Because it's not just a matter of plopping $5 billion down in Northeast Wisconsin. This also tends to be a very dirty process, right? So it requires some thoughtful approach to environmental regulation to make sure there's not negative environmental externalities. So I just bring that up to say, I think this is an area where a lot of good people are trying to figure out what the best path forward is. And I'd welcome Chris's thoughts. And before we lose it in Q&A, I want to foot stomp something that Chris said about building off certain structures in NAFTA. One thing that's always intrigued me too, and I wrote an op-ed to this effect about a year ago that nobody read, I think we have a real low-hanging fruit when it comes to a sort of a gold standard trade agreement with a post-Brexit UK that might result in some interesting technological collaboration. I think the big move we need to make here is not just investing a ton of money in Buy America. It's really to kind of harness that Buy America energy into a free world framework, a buy ally, as you refer to it, and build off the national technological industrial base of which Australia is officially a member, Canada is a member, the UK is a member, where we can really start to get cooperation with our closest allies, particularly on critical technology. As for the question about aerospace and DoD, I tend to think the big problem with the way, I think there's sort of two problems with sort of the defense industrial base that are related. One is that, power and money tends to be concentrated in about 5 companies, sort of the 5 defense primes. And it should not surprise anyone that it's hard to sort of get, commercial off the shelf technology adopted very quickly. But that's a reflection of a second problem DoD has, where we tend to sprinkle new money out for innovative projects very thinly along a bunch of different investments, when DoD probably needs to start making bigger investments on a smaller number of up and coming companies that hopefully one day will emerge as defense primes that can compete with legacy industries, and figure out the best balance of commercial off the shelf versus sort of, the way that the primes tend to do business. So some of that makes sense. Sorry to go on in a very weird direction. Chris, correct everything I said that's wrong.
I won't. Although I will say that I have much more experience than you in writing op-eds nobody reads. So at least I have that down. I was just going to ask you a little bit. There's a question that came through in the chat about resource nationalism and the extent to which the United States and Canada should, as well as could, get involved in trying to promote critical minerals development, et cetera. I know a little bit about what the US and Canada agreed to do, mainly driven by sort of market challenges. There's just too many critical minerals on the market that China controls, and they keep flooding the global market. So it's prohibitively expensive to bring new capacity on stream unless you have some sort of stockpiling or a market segmentation that says, the US will only buy from friendly sources, so China's kind of moot at this point. What do you think the I guess appetite in Congress is for taking those long range views to make sure that we have the inputs we need for some of these purposes?
Well, I think particularly when it comes to rare earth minerals, there's a big appetite in Congress. Myself and my colleague Joe Courtney, who chairs the Sea Power Subcommittee, and we're co-chairs of the Friends of Australia Caucus. We went to Australia a couple of years ago. We went to Western Australia. And so the thing we heard about more than anything else was mineral processing. And so we came back and we turned that into a sort of a modest piece of legislation that's intended to force the Defense Department to think through its rare earth supply chain. And there's been a lot of enthusiasm around that project. And you mentioned the Japanese Prime Minister's visit later this week, or I forget exactly. I'm living in a time warp now. One thing that's always intrigued me is I believe the Japanese had a massive discovery of a rare earth repository off their territorial waters in 2011, 2013. Now, it's one thing to discover it, it's another thing to extract, and then a whole nother thing to process. But for the life of me, I can't figure out why there isn't some sort of triple bank shot we could work on with Japan, all the knowledge, institutional knowledge in Australia, and then harness the power of American entrepreneurship and domestic manufacturing. And I think those are precisely the type of things that we should be investing in. And I think the best way to compete with China over the long term is not just sort of the defensive stick approach. It's the offensive, no, we are going to out innovate, out compete, and pooling our resources together. Even if you subsidize your state champions, even if you steal intellectual property, even if you kind of throw every trick in the book at us, we're still going to be able to outcompete you. That's sort of the mindset I think we need as free world allies, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Especially when it comes to things like critical minerals, yes, China dominates at the moment, but it's actually because China is prepared to do the dirty digging for them. There is deposits especially here in the United States, but also in the seabed of Japan. There are opportunities to dig it. There is greater opportunity for cooperation and development, and it really does have to be built upon trust. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to invite them to ask their questions directly to you, if I may. I'm going to call on Anthony Marchese first. If you can unmute yourself.
Hi. Now I believe you can hear me.
Yes.
Hey, thank you very much. I'm the chairman of Texas Mineral Resources, which is a company that's developing a rare earth and critical mineral project in Texas, just by way of background, not an advertisement. A couple of comments, actually, that one brought up. Someone brought up the issue of the Japanese deposits in the ocean. I hate to say this, but in our lifetime, that will never be developed. The environmental consequences of digging with that much pressure at the bottom of the ocean are enormous. It's just something that I think we'll just never see. We talk about environmental issues above the ground. You can't imagine the technical challenges there are in terms of dredging up material from the bottom of the ground and the disturbance that would cause to sea life, to in any case, I just wanted to point that out. That's the reason that's not going forward, or it has not been seriously taken. Just the environmental aspects are just too enormous. But I wanted to bring out an issue with respect to critical minerals and maybe to other things as well. We need the cooperation of the large industrial companies. You know, Congress has been very active. The exploration companies, if you will, mineral companies have been very active, very vocal. What's missing is the leadership of the large industrial companies. And I think there's so that's an area I think that needs to be addressed. First of all, the amount of money it would take to develop a serious critical mineral industry in the United States is a fraction of that of, for example, the semiconductor industry. You're not talking about billions upon billions of dollars. You talk about hundreds of millions. Part of the problem is that the leadership of these companies have not been vocal enough in emphasizing private investment. Most of the time, we're dealing with the supply chain officers, and their job, they get a bonus if something is delivered on time and on budget. What does that lead to? That leads to not really caring about where their supplies or their raw materials are coming from. Just there's no incentive there. Part of the real problem is they don't really know what constitutes a material in some of these components. If you ask some of these companies, where do your components come from? They'll tell you they come from Korea, they come from Taiwan, they come from Germany. But if you were to ask them, where are the raw materials coming from in those components, most of them would not have a clue, and they don't have to know. So I think part of it is accountability. If they were, for example, forced to confront the issue of where are your raw materials coming from, that I think would go a long way to making them more interested in working with companies in developing a critical material or mineral supply chain in the United States. Thank you.
Could I just comment briefly? Sorry, it's
sure.
Well, one, thank you for that nuance, and I'll have to revise my plans as well to buy Greenland from the Danes, because I'm sure we might run into similar environmental issues. And I think we had political environmentalists defeat the CCP's attempts to gain a controlling stake in certain rare earth projects in Greenland as well. You know, and on this question of getting the big sort of corporate players involved, I've always wondered if you could, given all the energy behind ESG investing, which was referenced earlier, if you could sort of expand sort of the concept of corporate social responsibility to, you know, kind of turn that G into like something that also covers genocide and not sort of building technology that abets genocide, and also resilience of the American domestic economy and of the free world, and get major corporations interested in not giving unnecessary leverage to hostile foreign countries. So I take your point, and I wish I had an easier fix for it.
We have a question also from Lyle Tritton.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Shihoko. So one of the things that we watch in the critical minerals space is the differentiation between country of origin, where something comes from, and who actually controls that. In particular, the Chinese investment has dominated many of the critical materials outside of China, so throughout the world, such as, for the last decade, the growth of nickel production in Indonesia entirely financed out of China. So if you're looking at country of origin, it may come from Indonesia, but if you're looking at who actually controls that and benefits from it, it's coming from China. And so I think we need a little sophistication around the language when we start looking at these mineral supply agreements.
I don't want to jump in, Congressman, but just to say I would agree with that. And I think this is one of those areas where bright lines are going to be very helpful for everyone. If we establish some clear guidelines that we want to see developed, resources that are developed in the right way, conscientiously, ethically, in support of the economy, I think that's going to raise costs in the supply chain. And as Mr. Marchese was saying, if you don't provide the right support for that, companies will be caught up in a race for the bottom. We have to hold those standards very high and say that only a high standard supply chain is acceptable. And I think this may be a bit grandiose, but in the struggle between the US and China, and maybe put Russia in the mix as great power competition, what distinguishes us in the United States and among our allies is that commitment to high standards. And it comes at a price. Our goods are going to be more expensive than when we could source them from China without looking too much at origin. And so the government should figure out, particularly with things like critical minerals, how can we create an environment where the right business decision for the company's bottom line is also the right decision for the country and our values. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think stockpiling may be a necessary part of this. Critical minerals are necessary for green energy as much as they are for batteries for electric vehicles, as much as they are for defense technologies. Maybe we need a strategic stockpile of lithium, of cobalt, and then the government provides the purchase and then pulls out of that stockpile to help support industry as needed for national priorities. Things like that are the kind of solutions I think we need in order to make sure the business still can make the right business decisions. We're not picking winners in the private sector, which is a mistake. Tempting as it sometimes gets for governments, it's better we don't. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure our businesses are able to make a profit in doing what they're trying to do. But anyway, I'm not a politician. I should defer to you, Congressman. You're in the business with a license and everything.
Well, no, usually I hide behind the experts on these panels, but Alyssa abandoned me, so I actually have to use my brain a little bit. But yeah, I think part of the political challenge though to that, first of all, I emphatically agree with everything you said. Again, I mean, like our country just went through this massive once in a generation stress test. We sort of need to methodically go through what we learned and think back a year ago. Again, it wasn't just that you were stockpiling toilet paper from Costco. It was we were realizing that our stockpiles weren't what we thought they were, right? In part because states sort of surrendered a lot of their stockpiling to the federal government through the years, and we took our eye off the ball. So I agree with that. I think part of the political challenge, though, is sort of what is the limiting principle, right? You can make a case for lithium and some of the critical minerals you talked about, but sooner or later, then every politician gets involved, and all of a sudden it's like we're stockpiling Teslas for everybody, and that's not necessarily what we want to be doing. And I've struggled with the right framework for identifying what is actually critical and limiting it so it doesn't go beyond the resources of the federal government and distort the free market economy of the United States.
Yeah. It also leads to a separate conversation about what is industrial policy from a US perspective. That industrial policy has, until very recently, been a very dirty word, but there's a lot of reconsideration, reassessment of what the national priorities are and what the national goals should be. But at the same time, as Chris said, we can't simply pick winners and focus on them, because those winners may actually end up not being winners. So it is a very delicate balance, but at the same time, going back to that question about public-private partnerships, there is only so much that the government can do, and it really does need that public commitment to move forward. I'd like to call upon Jared Barron.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, everyone, and fascinating conversation. I represent a company called Deep Green Metals, but I want to focus the question towards base metals, and particularly the metals that we need to build the batteries to power these electric vehicles. And if we think about two of those metals, nickel and cobalt, we know that 90% of the world's cobalt production ends up in China. And China controls the majority of the nickel production and nearly all of the nickel production growth. And we've seen people like Elon Musk say to the mining guys, please mine more nickel. So my question is, what steps have been taken to ensure battery metal availability in the US, not rare earths, but base metals, to build our batteries? And what considerations are being given to the deep ocean minerals, particularly given their scalability and compressed ESG impacts versus land-based mining? And I heard one of the earlier question talk about the environmental impacts of rare earths from the oceans. I can't speak to them, but what I can speak to are the environmental impacts of nodules, which of course were collected 50 years ago before there was before UNCLOS came into being. What I can tell you there is that the environmental impacts appear to be a fraction compared to the terrestrial alternative, and the scale is enormous. And of course, if I think about a resource that could be defended for supply into the US, an ocean-based resource is a very nice alternative. Thank you.
Well, I just quickly would say, I think Congress is still developing a rudimentary understanding of how we are in that situation, where 90% of the industry is dominated by the Chinese. And I suspect it goes back to just a longstanding assumption that we would never face disruptions to supply chain, or that integrating China into the global economy would moderate their behavior and result in a more cooperative relationship between our two countries, which of course did not happen. There was a certain logic to it, but it did not happen. And so what is Congress going to do about it? I would suspect at least two things. One, throw a little bit of money at the problem, and then two, potentially examine a lot of the regulatory barriers to what you talked about. And I do think that is sort of the grand bargain going forward. It's a smart investment, either via R&D necessary in these industries, or via the Pentagon somehow forming a partnership with private industry, combined with regulatory reform that hopefully will put us in a better position. But that's about as advanced as the conversation has gotten at this point.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think when you're talking about base metals, I think we've wasted some time in the last couple of years as we've tried to confront China. The United States has been all stick, no carrot. And with a country like Canada, we were hitting them with 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. And we should stop doing things like that annoy allies who are essentially on our side, and think of ways that we can create positive kind of reassurance. Like, Canada is a treaty ally, is willing to be on the inside with us. So we should be able to say, okay, we're not going to disrupt your ability to supply nickel to the United States. And that will be very positive about it, because I think the US has more friends than it sometimes recognizes. They just need to know that you're going to reward that friendship and you're going to give them a break if you can. And I think that's a good step in the direction. I know we talked a little bit about Buy American, and I understand the Buy American appeal to the United States. We want to get good value for taxpayer money too. And I think if we can start using tools like that a little more precisely so that we reward our friends, I think our friends will step up, or we should be able to expect them to do that.
Can I just, because you've stirred up a very not fond memory in my mind of the last 4 years. there were the 232 tariffs caused enormous pain, particularly for a manufacturing district like mine or an agricultural district. And there was an enormous amount of confusion trying to separate the 301 tariffs, sort of the anti-CCP tariffs, or put it in crude language, versus the 232 tariffs, steel and aluminum, that largely affected our allies. And I thought the latter actually undermined the former, right? In other words, picking an economic fight, to your point, with our allies at a time when we're trying to do something very difficult with China, where we need as much allied support as possible, didn't make any sense in my mind. And so I introduced a piece of legislation that would have reformed the initial glitch in 232 that allowed a president to claim we have a national security threat from Canadian steel or aluminum and impose a massive tax on the American people. And that's part of what Congress needs to do in these areas, is reclaim its authority so we don't bounce wildly back and forth between dramatically different interpretations and thereby send a signal of just chaos that private industry can't really deal with.
Right. And it's that instability that is really very detrimental to companies both in the United States and with the trading partners of the United States as well. We have 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more person to ask a question. Justin Prosser.
Good afternoon. My name is Justin Prosser. I'm with the National Mining Association. There's a lot of talk and discussion on rare earths and the focus on key supply chains in that space. One thing I would just caution as we look at this, the rare earths are absolutely necessary for critical defense technologies and renewable energy infrastructure. But we can't overlook, as someone mentioned earlier, the base metals or the quote unquote critical minerals and their focus on, their benefit to our economy. We oftentimes those are leapfrogged in the focus for rare earths, and in whether it's battery storage technologies or what, the recipe has not been set. And so, we need a regulatory framework that is nimble enough to react to changing market conditions, geopolitical issues, natural events or disasters. So, our focus has largely been, looking at criticality as a broad focus of trying to ensure that we have what we need when we need it. And that adds to the regulatory environment, where it takes 7 to 10 years or longer to permit a mining operation in the U.S. I can't speak to the underwater aspect, but I can only assume it's a big issue. But those are just some of the concerns that I would ask you to consider moving forward. So thank you.
That's really helpful, and this is a great takeaway from this discussion to bring back to my colleague, Congresswoman Slotkin, and the task force, because Congress does tend to be, sort of chase the shiny object, and, rare earth sounds cooler. It's like, insert hypersonics or blockchain or AI into a conversation, suddenly you sound smart. So this is a very helpful takeaway from this conversation.
And I'm afraid the time has come for us to go our separate ways. It's been a really great hour of discussing supply chains and really focusing on some issues, including critical minerals. So I really do want to thank all of you for joining us today, but I hope you will join me in thanking Congressman Gallagher in particular for sparing some time out of his very busy schedule to join us. So thank you very much. The Wilson Center Supply Chain Working Group will continue to convene on a regular basis. I hope we will see you again in the Zoom space. And so thank you and goodbye.